and welcome back to another All Things M365 Compliance. Of course, I'm Ryan John Murphy, Compliance Lead at Epic Global and Microsoft MVP, and I'm joined, as always, by Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, thank you, Ryan. I'm Nikki Chappell. I'm the Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway and also a Microsoft MVP. And today we are joined by Martin Lingstuyl. Over to you, Martin, to introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Martin Lingstuyl. I'm also an MVP in the category of Microsoft 365 development. And I work as a Microsoft 365 architect at I4U Business Solutions in the Netherlands. So I design and build solutions based on Microsoft 365 and Azure tools, mostly centered on productivity, collaboration, document management, that sort of thing. So thanks for having me.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. So, Martin, we noticed, Nikki and I, you've done some amazing work with the blogs that you created around retention, automating retention, using some of the scripting tools or Graph API and so on to basically allow you to configure, but not only that, allow to look for where retention labels have possibly not been applied accurately or not. So if you just give us a bit of a brief introduction of how you've come to this, what the benefits are, and then I think you want to share your screen and then go through your blogs and start walking us through some of the elements that you created.
Yeah, that's great. So so this whole conversation is about data lifecycle management, record management, data retention. Those all very fancy words, but to be honest, for me, this was a relatively new area till short. And so he was talking to this customer about retention labels and record management, and he just kept asking me questions. And every time I had to say, I'll look into it. I don't know exactly what's going on there or how this would work. And I generally don't like that. So what I did was I kept on digging I really wanted to know everything. Sure. I wanted to know the answer to the next question before he even asked it. So I came into this from that customer, and what they were doing was building this kind of document management system using SharePoint sites, document sets, a lot of metadata and stuff. And all this data needed to be archived in an orderly fashion, and they had to comply with archiving laws to do that. So and they have a lot of data, and they don't want to have people do this manually. So they wanted to take the next step and implement data lifecycle management, record management. And so we went through all that, and we had to look at the requirements. And I had to really dig into a lot of these things, how to do these things from an automation point of view, because the default things that are in Purview are very powerful, but also not always exactly fit for the scenario that you're working with. So in our scenario, we really had to dig into the programmatic side, and this is how I came up with this series of blog posts that I wanted to do on to help other people who are dealing with the same stuff as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important that, Microsoft provide these kind of APIs, to be able to programmatically do things. But a lot of us that are working in the compliance space are not developers. We understand kind of the business solution. We understand kind of the compliance roles. And we think, well, great, Microsoft's got this fundamental baseline. It works, but it hasn't got that automation. And I think having information like yourself really helped me recently with a proof of concept. I needed to try and demonstrate event-based retention, how to automate it. And having all of that kind of information to help kind of a non-developer try and develop something was really useful.
Yeah, so I think it's there's two large areas where it's very interesting to work with Purview, and it's on the one side it's managing retention labels, and on the other side is the automatic labeling, so the automation part. And I think the managing the retention labels is also a very important part, because as we've created a lot of retention labels lately, these things are not just content, right? They have a very big impact and a far-reaching impact in your system, and therefore there are scenarios when, for example, editing or deleting those labels is no longer possible. or it takes quite some time to do that. So you really need to think about before, how to build a setup in an orderly fashion, and to allow people to build these automation scripts or scripts of code to manage your labels is really important, because you can now deploy them in an orderly fashion. You can just create a script, you can show it to someone else to review it properly, and then you can deploy it to a test tenant for example, to not muck up production while you're doing that. And then only once you've seen that everything works as expected, you can now deploy to production. So I think that's really an important thing of using scripts and code to manage Purview.
Sure.
So,
sorry, Martin, I thought you'd finished talking. So I think, given the amazing work that you've done, do you want to share your screen and go through the blogs that you've created and the reasonings why? And then obviously the audience, the watchers and listeners can then start to understand, okay, I understand why you've done that, and that code is helpful to me, and I'm working on a project right now where this blog is going to be helpful to me.
Yeah. So I created a series of blogs. I'm now at, I think, 4 on Purview, and I'm thinking of more as we speak. So the first one is really the biggest one. This is a post on managing and applying retention labels using code. Let me see. It's being a bit slow today.
That's all right.
Well, whatever.
Okay,
so let's rip that out. So this post was my first post on the matter, and as you can see, this is a huge post. This is the table of contents is already big enough to fill an entire screen. And I did this because, when I first dove into this, I noticed that there was a lot of things about documentation for people like me, from architects and developers, that's not really there. It doesn't tell you everything that you need to know to do this. So I thought, let's find out everything that I can find out, and let's just try to see the different roads into managing and applying these labels. So in this post, there's a lot of information on both sides. So I'm showing how to manage those labels, and I'm showing how to use different tools to do that. So you can use the Graph API, or security and compliance, PowerShell, or even the CLI for Microsoft 365, which is a late addition to this group, to manage and apply your labels. So it's complete with script samples that should get you up and running. And I really took a lot of time to get this just right. You can just execute these scripts and get up and running. So another side of this is how you can apply labels to SharePoint content. So I'm from a SharePoint background here. I did a lot of work with SharePoint, a lot of work with creating setups like intranets or document management systems. So applying labels to SharePoint is for me it's very close to home. So I dove into all the different routes that are currently available. So you're in this blog, I'm referring to the SharePoint REST API, I'm referring to CSOM, I'm referring to the CLI as well. So you can use all kinds of tools to automate applying these labels. So while I was debugging through this, because I really had, for example, on the SharePoint API and the CSOM, there's very little to no documentation on how to use those. And as I went through them, I discovered this kind of dangerous setup where you can override the retention settings of Purview labels. And there's a really big section in this post specifically on that, to help people see the danger of using those APIs in an unsupported way. I also had some conversations with some other compliance people also over at Microsoft, and they've also said to me that these, using these APIs is a concern, and they will be deprecated in the near future.
Right.
and you should really try to use them in the right way, to use them with the correct values, etc., etc. So it's really a very full post. So it should help you out in anything regarding retention. Yeah.
So you've got the different methods there using SharePoint API. Is it CLI, PMP, PowerShell, etc. What would you recommend? And obviously, you've got the new graph extension as well, which I think will be replacing the SharePoint one in the future. What would be your recommendation to other people that say, I need to go out and start thinking about automating some of my records management process? Where do we start?
Yeah. So if you're talking about managing retention, you can use either the security and compliance PowerShell or the Graph API. Well, the CLI for Microsoft 365 also uses the Graph API, so you can use it as well. But the downside of using those two is that the Microsoft Graph API is currently still in beta, and it's not really complete yet. For example, you can create labels, but you cannot create label policies. So currently, as the current state is, I'd really advise to use the security and compliance PowerShell. This is a part of the Exchange online PowerShell module, and it's the most complete way to really manage purview retention labels. So if you're talking about applying labels, I'd go for using the SharePoint REST API currently. If you use CSOM, which is, of course, if you're into building applications with .NET Framework or something like that, you would be using CSOM mostly, but you would need to be really careful in how to use the APIs that CSOM offers currently. So I think there will be another endpoint, another method in CSOM that will come. I think I wrote it in my blog post. It will come in some time because we've got one safe endpoint to use in SharePoint REST API. It's called the bulk application endpoint. And this same method is not available in CSOM currently, but they are building it as we speak. So it should be possible to use that one in the near future. Let me see if I can find it somewhere here. I've noted it down here. So there's the set compliance tag on bulk items API that's in the REST API as we speak, but it's not in CSOM, but it's coming. So when we're applying labels, I should definitely use the SharePoint REST API. And if you really want to use CSOM, be very careful.
Okay.
On the other hand, what I did myself was use the CLI for Microsoft 365 to do that. So I created some Azure function with PowerShell based on the PowerShell scripting language, and I can just use the CLI or PMP PowerShell to automate these processes as well. So that's also a possibility.
Excellent. So I think that's one of 4 blogs, did you say, on Purview?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's another one that's really interesting as well. That was the second blog post. This is about event-based retention. So event-based retention is really the more complex setup of retention, right? So you're by default, you can start a retention period based on the date when a document was created, or the date when a document was last modified, or maybe the date when a document was labeled. For event-based retention, this is like saying you can start a retention period based on just any date you want. So this is very interesting, for example, with offboarding employees from your organization. So you want to take the offboarding date as the start date of the retention period, for example. And event-based retention is really rather complex to set up. And you also have to take a lot of things into account when working with that programmatically. So I did a separate blog post on that. That's also quite long. And I'm also thinking of adding an extra post on how to automate all this, because there are specific things to take into account then as well.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
And I think particularly with event-based retention, because it's not based on that date created or date modified or date labeled, you're going to be labeling the content probably at the beginning of its life or at some point. And at that point, it goes under indefinite retention, and the countdown only starts when you trigger the event. And, you know, say like an employee leaving or a contract ending, for example, a project finishing, we need a way of being able to say, right, this is now finished. How do I go and find all those artifacts, all those files, etc., and actually be able to trigger it? So I think this is kind of really useful, that ability to be able to automate it.
Yeah, and you know, there's very interesting stuff that I discovered along the way as well here. I think I didn't write everything down here, but you know, for example, if you use record management, right, you have a record type label that locks content down, share and you're using a event-based labeling. SharePoint will show a compliance asset ID field that will pop up right after you've labeled the item, if you do that manually. But this compliance asset ID field that you need to fill, you can't change it because the item is locked. You know, all of these little details that make working with this very interesting, at least.
Is that the immutable item you're referring to, Martin?
Yeah. So if you've got no, not immutable. So you've got records and you've got regulatory records, but even with normal records, if you've disabled, I mean, there's a global setting on the purview in Purview where you can say, you know what, disallow people from editing record properties. You know, if that's disabled, and it's disabled by default, and your event-based labels is configured to be a record, to label files as a record, that will mean that you cannot change metadata. And the compliance STID is also a piece of metadata. So you see, you know, while working with it, you discover that there are some things going on there that Microsoft hasn't really thought about as well. Because,
I came across exactly the same thing when I was doing some testing with a client recently. They said, we don't want people to be able to edit the file name. So I thought, oh, I'll go and change that property to stop people, you know, changing the metadata. Again, forgetting that all of those additional metadata fields are also part of that. And I came across the same thing. Oh, I wanted to be able to change something and you couldn't. So you do have to think about this. And I think it's really important what you said earlier about testing it in a test environment as well, making sure you've got it right, making sure you really understand it.
Yeah, that's a really important thing. Yeah,
for sure. And which other one was you wanting to show us today, Martin?
Well, I've got two more. I think I published the last one yesterday.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Let me just show the one this one I published last week, I think.
Sure.
Let me just show this quickly.
Of course.
And this is about finding it. Yeah.
I was going to say, while we're waiting for that, I'll just put up again your blog post link. So yeah, please go and have a look at it. It's like really detailed. I found it extremely useful for trying to learn about how you can automate things.
Yeah, it's a great blog.
I'm not sure what's going on here because maybe it's due to the recording that my site isn't working as expected. But we finally got it, so let's just move on. So this post is really about finding incorrectly applied retention labels. So as we spoke before, there is the possibility when you're using a CSOM or the SharePoint REST API to apply labels and override the default settings of the label while you're doing that. And you know, probably you could just make a mistake, you know, accidentally write the wrong code, use the wrong booleans, true instead of false, and mess things up. And this is really about finding those items so you can relabel them if you want to. And this is really interesting because when you look at it, it's also quite, you know, it's quite dangerous because you can label a file as a regulatory record, even if that file is, or even if that label has nothing to do with regulatory records. This is really, really interesting because it has the possibility to lock down that file completely. I mean, regulatory records are a very interesting feature, but they're also very powerful. I mean, no one can change that record, and so if you make an accidental an error in your script and use true instead of false there, it's really, it could be really destructive.
Indeed.
So so finding those things can be done using this script, and while we cannot just fix everything, because if you have a regulatory record, it's really locked down. It's nothing that you can do with that, I fear. So that's about this block. It's got a full-featured script below that you can just execute on your own tenant if you have enough permissions. That's really very.
Sorry, Matt. What does this actually do? Sorry, it basically just scans your environment to see if retention labels are applied accurately. How does it determine that?
So this script uses the CLI for Microsoft 365 to make a list of your labels. I'm seeing I wrote something wrong. I'll be adding a bug fix to my own blog right after this podcast. This line should get a list of labels, and then it will pick that label and search for files across your tenant. And a label has properties, so you can use the label properties to check if a file has the label correctly applied. Because on a file, you can also see, if you've got, for example, the SharePoint REST API, you can see the compliance information. So that's basically the information that was used, the settings that were used while you were applying the label. So, for example, it shows the date. It shows a few other things, like if it should be retained, if the file should be a record. These things you just get from that endpoint. So you can compare this to the label that you have in Purview and compare the properties, compare the property values.
Right.
And if they're different, well, then you know that they're applied incorrectly.
Yeah. Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
So does it kind of produce like a CSV or some sort of output of these files that are mismatched?
Well, that's possible, of course. Right now, this just outputs the data in your PowerShell screen.
Okay.
But it's very, very easy to make a CSV or an Excel file of that. That will be very useful in most scenarios, I guess.
Yeah. I think this is a very powerful blog. I think this would help a lot of people out, especially in those large organizations where you're publishing records, labels, quite a lot. This will now give you the ability to run this on a scheduled task, perhaps, Martin, Nikki, and just have one output every week to ensure that the documents you have are retained properly. So if you're wanting to use SharePoint as a compliance archive or to retain everything within there, then this would certainly help you to have insight into what is actually labeled. So I think this is a brilliant, brilliant post from you.
Well, I think you would rather use it. I think because if some things surface from this search, you have some work to do. You have to go through all of your compliance automations and see if some part of that is applying labels incorrectly, because you shouldn't want that. You should correct it immediately. So this is basically, I think, a check you would want to do once or twice. Maybe after some part of your organization has a deployed automation script for applying labels, and you want to check if that's working correctly or something. Or maybe in your organization there was this project on compliance like several years ago, and you want to check if things have been going all right. I would check in that case, but you shouldn't need to run it more than once or twice. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
So it's really every time you do an automation change. So when you deploy something, and then if you do some code changes later on, you're going back to make sure it's still correct.
This would be an extra check to make sure that your programmers have done the job correctly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I've noticed in this, not only is it looking for them, if it identifies a mismatch, it will then reapply the correct label with the correct permissions. So you actually, if you got an output of it, it was just a case of these were the errors and I've now fixed them. So there's no actual manual work as opposed to relabeling that anyone needs to do. It would just be the case of something's not right in our automation processes. We need to kind of have a look at that.
Yeah, but you need to be, of course, you need to be careful with that. The relabeling is interesting, but it will also change the retention period for some situations. For example, if you've got a retention label that is applied, let's say, that applies the retention term based on the date labeled, you know, that would mean that this script will change. Will change the date of the label, so it will change the retention period. So you should be careful about that.
Yeah, that's
aside from that, it's really interesting to just at least to surface those issues so you can do something about it.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a great post.
Yeah. So I do need to do some work here because I'm now seeing this. I made an error right there, so I'll need to change it after the post, after this podcast.
It's a work in process, Martin. Don't worry.
It's a work in progress, yeah. So I'm changing the other posts as well all the time because you know, new stuff is coming to light, and I just want to be as up to date as I can.
Of course.
Yeah.
And you have another one to show?
Yeah, the last one is about applying default labels, so applying labels to folders, and this is something that's been that's been very interesting because in the organization I'm working for, the customer I was working for, they're using document sets. So they've got all this metadata on document sets, and they had this loads of questions. So what about retention with document sets? Is the entire folder disposed of, or how should you see that? And there's a lot of things that I discovered when I was working with that, because I mean, you have to understand that when you label a folder, the folder itself is not under retention, and this is a very a thing you have to you have to wrap your mind about, because it has a lot of implications on how Purview will handle the data and how your automation, for example, will need to go. So I wrote down a couple of implications that using labels on folders has, but I think there might be more. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it looks very good. So just going through this one then, just scroll down, keep scrolling down so we can see most of the other content.
Yeah. So one of the most interesting ones is this one. It's about document set metadata. So say you've got this record type label, and you're an organization and you use document sets a lot, and you have all kinds of metadata and document sets, and you might even share information from the document set with the files in that document set. You know, this is possible in SharePoint. It's very interesting, very powerful features, for example, for document management. Now, if you're using a record type label and you apply it to that document set, under certain conditions, that means that the document set metadata can still be changed, while the file information cannot be changed. So this, because the files, I mean, the folder is not under retention, but the files are, and those are records. So you can change the document set metadata, but you cannot change the file metadata. And this is very interesting. It leads to all kinds of strange things, like what about sharing metadata? You know, as soon as you change metadata on the document set, the files in those document sets will not have those changes anymore because, well, they're records. That's just one of them. I mean, there's a lot of those. I also have got a very interesting one on event-based retention. Nikki, is probably interesting for you as well. If you're using labels with folders, you really need to check this out and see if you thought of that.
Yeah, I'll definitely have a read of that, because that was one of the things that I'd been trying, that as well as putting like a default label on the document library, was applying different default labels onto the different folders, and also applying default metadata to the folders as well. So based on different activities, sites were being, it was part of a provisioning process for groups, teams and sites, actually going out and provisioning a project type site, for example, and having the right document libraries and the right folders and metadata in place. So yeah, I'll definitely be looking at this later.
Yeah. I think this is a great series of blogs, Martin. I really do think that anybody watching or listening to this from a compliance world or even from a SharePoint or developer world would be very much interested in these. Nikki's put your blog up at the bottom again. It's blimp.nl. So I think we're just on time as well there, aren't we? So anything else from your side, Martin, before we finish up?
Well, I'd say keep watching, because there's some more posts coming.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I'll share them on my LinkedIn and Twitter, as I'm sure Nikki will do as well, once you post them, Martin. And who knows, maybe we can get you back on in a couple of months' time to go through the other blogs as well. But thanks for your time today. This has been very, very interesting, and I think this is going to make for a great podcast. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you as well for having me.
You're very welcome. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Goodbye for now.
Bye.